Hello, everyone. Oh, wait, no, is this? Yes, this is correct. Hello, everyone, although I don't need my name on the screen for this one. Hi. It's been, a long day. I will say, today's been a little bit of a disaster. We need some more light, though. Very, very little was accomplished today. I was tired earlier and I was literally sitting here at the desk and I was working on projects and things and I was tired and I lay down for a nap and that was kind of it. That's where the day sort of never got off the ground. And then I slept for 3 hours, even though I'd slept well. But it was a busy weekend. Much was accomplished. I did a bunch of laundry. We had some home repair to take care of, and that was a lot of hauling and up and down the stairs and blah 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 blah. So that was the whole thing. But it was good. So I'm definitely going to be living in the consequences of my actions tomorrow as I get busy getting stuff done. Possibly even later this evening after the show, we'll knock some stuff. We'll knock some stuff out. So, we have a good batch of news stories this week. I want to remind everyone that if you like this show and love this journalism, please, please, please join Cameron Journal Plus. We appreciate you for doing that. It's only $5 a month, which is really, really awesome. Very inexpensive, and it helps support the journalism that I do in bringing the news to you. If you've not signed up for the Cameron Journal newsletter, you definitely should. We had a nice group of news stories on the Saturday newsletter as well, and so that's a lot of fun. I also want to remind everyone. If you're listening and watching to the show and you're interested in my writing content, today's interview is with a wonderful woman who wrote a book about her difficulties with the medical system and advocating for her son. The Power of Story writing courses are still very much available. I don't mention those nearly enough, and I need to find a better way to promote them, especially on writing focused podcast episodes and everything, because I don't think I've talked about it enough. But if you're interested in that, those are available. Head over to the Cameron Journal Academy, which you can access that two ways. You can go to writingstudio.cameronjournal.academy. That's the long way. Or just go to cameronjournal.com and click on coaching. That's the faster way. And I also do offer writing coaching. So if you're thinking about writing a book, starting your thought leadership journey, definitely consider me in helping you with all of that. I also want to mention, the Cameron Journal is now on Substack. So if you are not interested in signing up for another thing, which I totally get, a new account, another website, very tedious, I totally get you. If you're already on Substack and you want Cameron Journal content delivered directly to your inbox, cameronjournal.substack.com. I do very limited content. It's literally just the newsletter, the podcast interviews. It's not the breadth and depth of content at cameronjournal.com, but if that's a little bit easier for you as a platform, please feel free to sign up there as well. It's been an interesting week in the news. There hasn't been a ton of stories. I did do on the newsletter on Saturday. I did cover some of the latest updates with Tulsi Gabbard and the whole Russia Gate 2.0 thing, and the latest document dumps about the interesting developments in what the Obama administration did at the end of their term into the Trump term to do with quote-unquote Russian collusion, all this type of thing. I think it's very interesting that all of this stuff is coming out now, given that Trump was on Fox News literally this weekend, talking about how, we're not going to release the Epstein files because many people could be hurt. And I had that video, and the place that had posted it had deleted the tweet, which sucks, and is very unfortunate. And I went looking all over to try to find it again, couldn't find it. But I did cover that in the newsletter. That was kind of the biggest story of the week. So this gives us a chance to catch up on some of the other stories that don't get covered when big stuff happens. So we have a handful of news stories, a couple threads I want to talk about. We also may get into a couple of my saved stories in my Apple News. Uh, in my Apple News if we don't have a lot of time. But I will admit, I'm a little tired. I'm a little low energy. I had a whole iced coffee and went to sleep. If that should give you any clue as to how well I'm operating today. So, we may just cover the news stories I saved and call it a night. We'll see how we go. But let's turn to the headlines. There we go, and we're going to do that, and we're going to do that. So I want to start out talking about a little bit about the economy. Right before I was getting ready for this show, I was watching an Adam Conover video. You remember Adam Conover from that show called Adam Ruins Everything? Oh my goodness. That was a whole thing. And he was talking about Zoran Mamdani showing Democrats how to win, and that his running on making life more affordable for the working class in New York City was popular and people were excited about it. And that's all fine and well, but people miss why voters were mad in 2024. The affordability thing was definitely a factor of it, but it had a lot more to do with post-COVID inflation than anything else. And I feel like everyone's like, oh yeah, well, if we go for government-owned grocery stores and making things more affordable, that would get people back on board with Democratic policies. People were mad about affordability, but they were mad that prices had gone up. They weren't necessarily looking for a solution other than life is too expensive. And this thread gets into something very interesting that, has to do with how the numbers are being reported and why people are unhappy. And it gets into kind of a different aspect of the problem. And this is not going to be solved by a government-owned grocery store or any of the other things that Mamdani is proposing with, buying up housing and making it, cheap and available for people. It gets nothing to do with that. It really has to do with the cost of goods and where you derive your labor. And this thread, even though it comes from Crusader Pepe, is very good. It begins, I want to bridge the gap between boomers and young people. Young people are frustrated because inflation is significantly underreported by CPI, and if you don't own assets, then you are getting crushed. Over the past 10 years, inflation is close to 100%, not 31% like CPI says. Over the past 10 years, CPI sets inflation about 31%. In reality, it's probably closer to 70 to 100%. This is because CPI has a few critical flaws in it, and this is true. The first major flaw is substitution. It assumes if beef is more expensive, you will buy chicken instead. This is still a reduction in quality of life, but CPI uses this trick to make inflation seem lower than it actually is. Another example of this is that CPI may claim that a product has improved, like a computer's processing power and offset price increases, even if these improvements don't add any value to the product and is actually more expensive for consumers. That is particularly true in automotive with safety equipment. One of the big complaints back in the 90s when they made airbags mandatory was that it made cars more expensive by about $400 or $500 per car. And people said at the time, well, yes, the car is slightly more expensive, but it's also much safer, and that's important as well, sort of thing. This thing happens all the time. And then the thread continues. Finally, it has a hard time adjusting for a reduction in quality. For example, what used to be 100% beef hot dog now has filler in it like corn syrup and other additives to make it cheaper. You are getting less actual hot dog, but CPI cannot easily pick that up. What does create this friction between boomers and young people? Because boomers own assets that have appreciated. The global stock market has gone up 115% during the last 10 years. This has helped insulate them from the worst effects of inflation. They also own homes, which have appreciated about 70% during this time period, also helping insulate them from inflation. Boomers felt some pain, but have not felt the pain as much as younger people without significant assets. Their wages have effectively decreased 20 to 50% net. I don't blame boomers simply for owning assets, but they refuse to accept the reality that I have outlined above, opting instead to talk about why the concerns of young people are legitimate, but they are. I am hoping that the boomers who read this thread come to understand what has changed over the last 10 to 20 years. Please don't dismiss this immediately and give it some consideration for the benefit of your children. What makes all this worse is that it means stocks have had close to a 0% real rate of return net of inflation, despite the fact that governmental and consumer debt is through the roof. Our economy is turning into a zombie economy without growth. This is why young people are so frustrated and upset. They may not understand what's going on, but they sure can feel it. What we're doing is not working, which is why they want change as opposed to the status quo. And before someone blames us on Trump, no, this is the result of 50 years of poor decision making. And one of the first comments here is quite prescient. It says, "Yep, I don't feel like I earned that much more than when I made half as much." And he said, "This is why, unfortunately." And then it goes hard. Some of these other comments are quite good. It says the boomer man's core identity is that they worked hard. Their position is an emotional, not necessarily a logical one. You work 60 hours this week? Well, I worked 80-hour weeks. The question they are the hardest working generation ever is to dismiss their very identity. And it goes on to other comments, agreeing sort of thing. And it's, and people kind of have added some other memes like this one when they talk about the Fed funds effective rate and how between 1980 and now interest rates have been on a steady decline all the way down to where they were basically at zero through most of the 2010s, went up modestly during the pandemic, and are really kind of returning to somewhat normal levels, and everyone's freaking out like, oh, we need lower interest rates. Like, actually, they're the lowest they've been in decades, sort of thing. It's, but this is a very important thing. When the spending power of your dollar goes down, you can make a lot more money and still not get ahead. And I kind of laugh at boomers, because a lot of them were alive during the late 70s when this was a huge problem with stagflation, and we got into a wage price spiral where wages were going up, but prices were going up, and wages were going up, and prices were going up in lockstep, and the only way Volcker broke that was to jack interest rates so insanely high that people literally stopped borrowing money, and that broke the back of inflation, and prices actually started to go down, and we had modest deflation, which caused a small recession in the early 80s. That it's kind of funny that they forget that defined a lot of their own youth, which again, entertaining, but that was the thing, and they seem to have forgotten all of that, because that's a similar thing to what this thread is talking about has happened over the last decade or so, is that you have a situation where, yeah, people are making more, median income is higher, but the spending power you have is so much less. After the 70s stagflation, what made the prosperity in the 80s and 90s possible was the fact that a lot of consumer goods, because of offshoring, got a lot cheaper. Televisions, washers and dryers, computers, all this type of thing. Those got a lot cheaper. I mean, now you can buy a 100-inch TV for hundreds of dollars. That wasn't even on sale 30 years ago, and if you had been able to get a large TV, it would have been very expensive. That's not the case anymore. You have this, that was what Alan Greenspan, kind of the bargain they made, which was talked about very elegantly in this documentary called The Flaw, is that they allowed this kind of renaissance of consumer debt. Before about the late 1980s, consumer debt was relatively rare. People had some stores offered credit, store cards, this type of thing, but most people, you didn't really loan money to everyday people. I mean, most people had a house mortgage, and the terms were a lot shorter. It was 10 or 15 years, not 30. The 30-year mortgage didn't get introduced until 1987. And you had very little consumer debt. In the late 80s into the 90s, there was this explosion of consumer debt. All of a sudden, you had credit cards. You were able to, charge stuff, pay things on over time. That also allowed a lot of growth through consumption that was not hitherto possible, and it papered over the fact that wages stagnated. That was how Volcker broke stagflation, was wages stayed the same, the prices of some consumer goods went down, the cost of a lot of other things, most things that couldn't be outsourced, went up dramatically. Education, healthcare, housing, this sort of thing. What did this all lead to? It led to a situation where you basically caused decades of economic growth that wasn't necessarily real. And that's what this thread is talking about, is that now we're kind of back in the same situation we were in the late 70s, where the spending power of money is getting a lot worse, and so it doesn't matter that you're making more money. The spending power is down so much that functionally, in terms of what you can buy with your money, we're no farther ahead than we were. Now, if you've owned assets, this isn't necessarily a problem because the assets have done very well and they have, made a lot of money and provide a lot of income. If you derive your wealth from labor, this is a huge problem because you may be working more, you may have another job, you may have a side hustle, whatever have you, but you're not getting ahead. You're not any farther ahead today than you were a while ago. And so this ends up in a terrible situation where, for most young people who are still trying to, they're not even just trying, they're trying to make money to buy things and get ahead and save money, and the cost of living is simply too high. And it's because the amount of what you can buy with your dollar has gone down dramatically. And that, we have some ballpark numbers in here, but the reason why people feel like I'm not any farther ahead than I was is because of these dynamics. To surmise, the money's been funny. The money's been funny for a while. And this is why we have this situation. And it's because, as Thomas Piketty said in his book Capital, in the 21st century, it will be better to own assets than it'll be better to derive your income from assets rather than income derived from labor, because the value of labor will go down while the value of assets will go up. And some of these comments are just so good. It says here, Shadow Stats estimates between 80 to 110% of inflation between 2015 and 2023 if we still measured by 1980 measurements. And then someone posted a video about the inflation line, why CPI is a scam. And it says that in 1981, the CPI formula was completely changed, which lowered the measurement by 10%. And that is, they do change out how they calculate CPI over a while to respond to quote unquote economic changes. And it says here, the fun fact, the reason that CPI underreports inflation is because they don't want to increase payments for government benefits like VA disability, since those things are supposed to adjust with inflation. By underreporting inflation, they can shortchange beneficiaries. And it says, good luck with the boomers, don't listen, they don't care to learn. They have 13-foot ceilings and their actions are always just. That is unfortunately so true. And it's just, these threads are always fascinating to me because it's always interesting to see how people respond to this and how, people will express what they've been feeling, what they've been seeing in response to like this, and it's always a quite stark thing. But it's when we talk about, and this has happened over the last couple of years, when we talk about how good or bad the economy is doing or whatever have you, and people are looking at their wallets, they're looking at their spending, all this type of thing, and they're being like, where's this great economy? Like, I can't buy as much as I used to. I'm making compromise at the grocery store, all this type of thing. This is part of the reason why. The spending power of money is just not what it once was. And I want to immediately jump over into this thread by Jared Ryan Sears. Now, this thread is a bit interesting because a lot of stuff in here is not quite right, in a word. But we'll get into it. It says here, the U.S. economy, once the envy of the world, quickly ground to a halt in the matter of months after Trump took office. It was a predictable outcome, as economists and experts had warned that enacting broad tariffs would lead to job losses and increased inflation. What is shocking that according to 24 exit polls, the top issue for Trump voters was the economy. There is nothing about Trump's history that suggests he understands economics. His wealth, aside from his crypto bribes and the money he earned from selling subpar, often tacky products to his supporters, was inherited. Trump's list of failed businesses fills an entire page, and he was convicted of falsifying business records 34 times. His last presidency was marked by the decline of manufacturing in the U.S., a loss of total jobs, growing more income inequality, and rapidly rising debt. So why did so many people vote for Trump if they wanted a better economy? They've been repeatedly lied to. Fox News and other right-wing media said the global high inflation was due to Biden instead of the pandemic. When inflation dropped to normal levels faster than our peer nations, the lie was it was still high. As GDP growth was robust, Fox said the economy was slowing, and while the debt-to-GDP ratio was shrinking, they said it was rising out of control. The Biden administration didn't just tackle inflation and the debt. America experienced the longest stretch of low unemployment in over 50 years. High-tech manufacturing jobs added jobs every month of his presidency. No administration is without its flaws, but the economy was not one of Biden's. In June 2024, the World Bank wrote, there are, of course, notable bright spots in the global economy. The U.S. economy in particular has shown impressive resilience. Growth has remained buoyant in the teeth of the fiercest monetary policy tightening in 4 decades. U.S. dynamism, in fact, is one reason the global economy enjoys some upside potential over the next 2 years. Ian Cozy, the World Bank's deputy chief economist, said at the time that U.S. growth is exceptional. By the time the election rolled around, inflation had returned to normal ranges, wages had been outpacing inflation for years, and the lowest earners had seen the largest gains. However, millions of Americans hadn't adjusted to the higher prices that had become the new normal during the pandemic recovery. There was also continuous doomsaying from media outlets and podcasters, such as Joe Rogan, about the best economic situation we could hope for following a pandemic that shut down the world. Millions of Americans became convinced that the strong economy was a disaster in desperate need of rescue. Enter Trump, who with the help of Fox News and right-wing podcasters created a revisionist history of his first presidency and made impossible promises on how he would make America rich. They invented a problem, then claimed to have the solution. We're going to pause here for a moment, because there's some issues here. So, this first bit. And the lowest earners had seen the largest gains. That's the first problem. And I wish they had addressed this. Because the reality is if you were upper middle class, the inflation was inconvenient but didn't really affect your lifestyle. If you were the lower end of class, you had tremendous wage gains that were greater than inflation. If you were middle class, between about $50,000 a year and about $200,000, you saw your buying power evaporate. And if you remember our Crusader Pepe thread over here, we now know why, sort of thing. So, yeah, if you were, making between $50,000 and about $200,000, you have watched your quality of life and your lifestyle decrease dramatically quickly. The other part of this that no one talks about, and this is not necessarily Biden's fault, but the pandemic ended it, is coming out of the 2008 crisis. The Fed had lowered rates to nearly zero. In fact, we can see that in this helpful graph from the other thread. Where is it? Right here. This whole area, there's 2008, 2010, 15. Interest rates start to rise ever so slightly in 16, 17, 18, 19, sort of thing. They started bringing them back up to sort of normal. But you had this whole period of basically free money. And eventually, when you shut off the spigot, it's going to be very difficult, when you're not, the Fed isn't buying all the bad debt, when you have actual interest rates happening, all this sort of thing, this ends up being, a problem sort of thing. And that leads, to, you end up usually with an inflation situation after that, or at least an economic slowdown. Now, that was kind of covered up by the pandemic, because they had just raised interest rates, but they weren't very high, so they brought them back down to zero, and then when inflation hit hard, more than the 2% a year, they then rapidly raised interest rates to control inflation, as they should, and we got Jerome Powell's soft landing, which if you follow me on LinkedIn and do follow my exclusive LinkedIn newsletter, I wrote about the story of Jerome Powell's soft landing. And so that loss of buying power in the middle class is why a lot of people felt like the Biden economy was not good. I said in January of 2024 that Biden should not talk about how good the economy is because it's good for very few people. It's good at the very, very top, it's good at the very, very bottom, but the great middle where most people live, not good. Now, the rest of this, and this idea that millions of Americans had adjusted to the higher prices to become the new normal during the pandemic recovery, yeah, that's the most important bit. And yes, and also a lot of people were unhappy that this was all caused by a pandemic shutdown that was later deemed to maybe be an overreaction to what the pandemic was and how bad it was. And then, yes, Trump enters along and says he'll fix it all, sort of thing. So, the man who promised a booming economy has destroyed the one we had. There have already been more layoffs in 2025 than the entire year of 2024. Only 106,000 jobs were created over the last 3 months. 2024 averaged 186,000 every month. GDP growth averaged 1.25% for the first half of 2025 compared to the 2024 average of 2.8%. Manufacturing jobs are leaving America again after hundreds of thousands were added under Biden. Inflation has been rising for months. Unemployment is on the rise, and ongoing jobless benefits for people who remain unemployed are at their highest level since the pandemic. Farms are going bankrupt at an alarming rate. Foreign tourism to the U.S. is in decline. Vegas feels empty. The debt is rising faster than last year. Combine that with a significant decrease in GDP growth, and the debt-to-GDP ratio is going the wrong way fast. The U.S. credit rating has been downgraded. Housing costs and interest rates remain unstubbornly high. Consumer sentiment is low. All true. The numbers are so bad that Trump just fired the person responsible for releasing the monthly job totals, not because the person did anything wrong, but because the truthful numbers show how badly Trump is failing. The authoritarianism everyone has been warned about has once again reared its ugly head. The entire economic mess is because of Trump's trade war tariffs. He found the fastest way to bring an economy that was powering the world to a standstill. The debt is increasing while the government does less for us. Critical weather monitoring services are cut, the bureau that protects consumers from predatory and illegal corporations is cut, and health care for millions of Americans is cut. So where's that extra debt coming from? All the money flowing to corporations and the wealthy when they already had a massively oversized share of the pie. The silver lining is that while Republicans are still supporting Trump, independents or not, the midterms will end the complete control the GOP has over Congress. I'm not so sure about that, which has allowed terrible bills such as the Big Beautiful Bill to become law, but it will take a lot longer to fix the economy than it took to ruin it, and Trump will still be in the White House, ready to block any legislation that would address the mess he created, because it would expose his ineptitude. The modern Republican Party doesn't know how to govern and doesn't understand economic policy. All they have are lies, conspiracy theories, and creating culture wars, none of which will help them as more and more Americans realize how expensive life is becoming due to their failed policies. And this, the first comment is quite prescient. How do you fix the $2 trillion yearly budget deficit without growth in revenue? Cut spending or use tariffs to create both? No, you start by fixing the income tax, and that is 100% correct. Tariffs do create revenue by taxing American citizens, that is true, but they do not create growth. They're actually a barrier to growth. And the reason why I thought this thread was a bit prescient is I do think people are looking for an economic turnaround. I'm not convinced that 2026 is going to be a great year for Democrats. Mostly because the Democratic Party is entirely in disarray and is fighting within itself. That's a whole other problem. But these two threads together, I think, really paint a picture of why the economy for the average person is just in a terrible state. And people feel it and it's like, well, especially if you're working, it's like, oh, you're working, you have a job, all this type of thing, that's really cool and good. It's like, yeah, but people are kind of like, but it's not feeling like this money's doing far enough, everything's so expensive. You have people doing videos in their cars to be like, everything is so expensive. And the reality is everyone's pulling back. I have a lot of friends who still work in the service industry in different cities, and they are all echoing what's happening in Vegas. People aren't coming out. People aren't tipping. We're not making any money. People are, pulling back from everything because a trip to the grocery store is so expensive. All of these things are so expensive. And that all adds up quickly. It doesn't take long. It all begins to add up in a very meaningful way that gets very expensive very quickly. And that is a very difficult a very difficult thing, and that then starts to become a cycle of people pull back, they're spending less, and that ends up, you can't find growth because people aren't spending money, and then you end up with the economy starting to shrink. As people pull back more people get laid off, the economy shrinks, businesses lay off because people aren't spending money, and then you can end up in this terrible cycle. The only kind of great thing, and it's not really great if you have a lot of debt, is you can end up in a deflationary cycle, which China has right now. You end up in this terrible deflation where you're then paying old, expensive, inflated debt with new, more expensive dollars, and that becomes its own problem. Deflation is great for prices, but not necessarily great for anything else in your life. How do we get out of this? That's the pathway forward out of this economic mess is not an easy one. I would say the first thing would be to get rid of all tariffs. Re-engage in global trade, but that's going to take, we didn't create globalism in a year, and it's going to take a lot longer to recreate it. And a lot of people may no longer be interested. The pathway out of this is not easy. It's not straightforward. The tariffs will create a lot of revenue, but the reality is that's sucking more money out of the economy. And not from the wealthy. It's from people who buy things. It's everyday people. The thing people forget is the wealthy, when they get money, the money does not move. It goes into assets and causes asset inflation, or it goes into accounts that does not move very quickly. When you give the upper middle class, and poor people money, it immediately goes back out into the economy because they go out and buy stuff. When you have a situation where those groups, when you have a lot of tariffs, those groups end up paying it the most. So when prices go up due to tariffs, and we've already seen price increases due to tariffs, then you're pulling more money out of that end of the economy. People spend less money because they have less money to spend. The economy shrinks. And so you can end up in this terrible cycle where you have this shrinking, no-growth economy, but that's still producing great tariff revenue. But people are going to spend less on a lot of stuff. And I will give credit to the Trump administration. A lot of these dynamics, like we learned in the first thread, existed before he got into office. He promised to fix it and has gotten nowhere. The tariffs have been terribly damaging. Biden was bringing back manufacturing with no tariffs. So if you're out there right now and feeling like the economy is a bit of a disaster right now, there's a reason for that. And that's that we started out with an economy that was not working for working people, and we're now in an economic situation where you're being taxed for being a working person who's out there spending money trying to create a life for yourself and not getting ahead because inflation is so high, because we have tariffs now, all this sort of thing. And so, yeah, the pathway forward out of this is not an easy one. Obviously, lowering tariffs would be good. I think, fixing the tax code, which he talks about here, would be very helpful. It's, having maybe some capital outflow regulations would be helpful. A financial services tax is not a bad idea. But unwinding this economic mess and being willing to let the price of assets fall, which they have been unwilling to do since '08, would be probably the first way to do that. But no one's talking about that at this juncture. So that's enough on the economy. I want to turn our attention to Mark Halperin's Substack, the wide world of news, and I want to get into his invisible primary for the Democrats because this is entertaining. So let's begin from the beginning. So every 4 years more accurately, Mark Halperin does an invisible primary of who he thinks has the best chances of getting the nomination in the following presidential election. And this, I think, is his first one for 2028. And it's interesting. So we'll start from the beginning. So in the invisible primary, we have... I'm turning on a bit of a fan because it's a little bit hot in here. I'm not going to turn on the air conditioner. We have an interesting sort of beginning. So we have For Commander-in-Chief, which is category of just who seems presidential, we have Wes Moore and Senator Kelly of Arizona. And they certainly look presidential there. However, it gets much more interesting. For high polling and name identification, we have Harris and Newsom, which is interesting. The quote-unquote hang test, in terms of who would you want to hang out with, Buttigieg and Shapiro win. Made for TV is Gavin Newsom and AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Money, who's got the money to finance the presidential run? Pritzker and Rahm Emanuel. A favorable record and favorable issues. We have no surprise here. Shapiro and Beshear of Kentucky. Shapiro is the governor of Pennsylvania. Beshear is the governor of Kentucky. Personal and love story. We have Wes Moore and Ro Khanna. Ro Khanna is not going to win, so we can just forget about that. Popular in early states, early primary states, we're talking Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, we have Wes Moore and Gavin Newsom. Electability factor is Shapiro and this woman named Raimondo. I had not ever heard of her before this. Don't really know who she is, but apparently people think she's electable. Media coverage, we have Gavin Newsom and Ro Khanna again. Buzz and momentum is Gavin Newsom and Wes Moore. Who's good in the digital game is AOC and Newsom. Who's really got the fire in the belly, really wants it, Klobuchar and Buttigieg. I don't know why we're talking about Amy Klobuchar. In terms of party constituencies, Harris and Shapiro up again. The staffing consultant class is looking at Gavin Newsom and Rahm Emanuel. So, if you're Kamala Harris, do you think a 28 presidential run is worth it for you? I would say probably not. I mean, yeah, she polls high right now and has name ID, and that's all cool and everything. But I mean, if I'm Wes Moore, I'm looking at this list with a lot of hope. I mean, especially given everything. If I was Wes Moore, I'd form a committee. Gavin Newsom's obviously running for president in 2028. I think AOC will definitely make a try. I don't think she gets the nomination, but just because the Democratic Party has run 2 women in the last 10 years and they both lost. So I think if you're a woman this cycle, this is not the cycle for you. Which also knocks out Kamala Harris as well. Also knocks out Amy Klobuchar. I think it's going to be a guy. I think if you're Wes Moore or Gavin Newsom, this is good news for you. I think Wes Moore is going to try to dial into that Obama energy. Gavin Newsom is going to dial into the we got to turn the ship around energy. Younger, cooler, all this type of thing. Neither of these two. I think AOC will probably do a primary run, but she's not going to get it. If I'm Mark Kelly looking at this list, I would definitely forget about running for president. He only kind of appears once, but Mark Halperin has a lot of inside connections to the Democratic Party, so I kind of am always interested in his, invisible primary, sort of picks. And this is really great news for Wes Moore and Gavin Newsom. I worry about Gavin Newsom and the California baggage. A lot. Andy Beshear of Kentucky, I think, has a lot more appeal. Shapiro of Pennsylvania is also good. But yeah, I think the competition, if things stay the way they are broadly, is a Wes Moore, Gavin Newsom conversation. Speaking of people of color, though, this is a story I found last week, and I kind of wanted to dig into it a little bit just for funsies. Well, let me start from the beginning. So, I was on Twitter, and they were talking about how difficult it is to be biracial in this country. And I understood that a great deal because I am biracial and I live in this country, and it has not always been an easy thing. Not by far. And so when they were talking about, the tragic mulatto myth, and the tragedy of being mulatto and not fitting into either world, I never really heard of that before, but I had read a book during my MFA called Passing, and they talk about it in here, and I was kind of like, okay, I know a little bit about this, but I clicked on the link to just kind of find out a little bit, more about the history of this, because even I was not necessarily aware entirely of it. And so I just want to read a little bit of this article and kind of dig into this A little bit, because, it affects me. So it says here, Lydia Marie Child introduced the literary character that we call the tragic mulatto in two short stories, The Quadroons in 1842 and Slavery's Pleasant Homes in 1843. She portrayed this light-skinned woman as the offspring of a white slaveholder and an enslaved black female, in many such cases. This mulatto's life was indeed tragic. She was ignorant of both her mother's race and her own. She believed herself to be white and free. Her heart was pure, her manners impeccable, her language polished, and her face beautiful. Her father died, her Negro blood discovered, and she was remanded to slavery, deserted by her white lover, and died a victim of slavery and white male violence. A similar portrayal of the near-white mulatto appeared in Clotel, 1853, a novel written by black abolitionist William Wells Brown. A century later, literary and cinematic portrayals of the tragic mulatto emphasized her personal pathologies, self-hatred, depression, alcoholism, sexual perversion, and suicide attempts being the most common. If light enough to pass as white, she did, but passing led to a deeper self-loathing. She pitied or despised black people and the blackness in herself. She hated or feared white people, yet desperately sought their approval. In a race-based society, the tragic mulatto found peace only in death. She evoked pity or scorn, not sympathy. Sterling Brown summarized the treatment of the tragic mulatto by white writers. White writers insist upon the mulatto's unhappiness for other reasons. To them, he is the anguished victim of divided inheritance. Mathematically, they work it out that his intellectual strivings and self-control come from his white blood, and his emotional urgings, indolence, and potential savagery come from his Negro blood. Their favorite character, then the Octoroon, wretched because of the single drop of midnight in her veins, desires a white lover above all else, and must therefore go down to a tragic end. Vara Caspari's novel The White Girl, 1929, told the story of Solaria, a beautiful mulatto who passes for white. Her secret is revealed by the appearance of her brown-skinned brother. Depressed and believing that her skin is becoming darker, Solaria drinks poison. A more realistic but equally depressing mulatto character is found in Geoffrey Barnes' novel Dark Luster, 1932. Alpine, the light-skinned heroine, dies in childbirth, but her white baby lives to continue a cycle of pain. Both Solaria and Alpine are repulsed by black people, especially black suitors. Most tragic mulattoes were women, although self-loathing Sergeant Waters in A Soldier's Story clearly fits the tragic mulatto stereotype. The troubled mulatto is portrayed as a selfish woman who gave up all, including her black family, in order to live as a white person. These words are illustrative. Don't come for me. If you see me in the street, don't speak to me. From this moment on, I'm white. I am not colored. You have to give me up. These words were spoken by Piola, a tortured, self-hating black girl in the movie Imitation of Life. Piola, played adeptly by Freddie Washington, had skin that looked white, but she was not socially white. She was a mulatto. Piola was tired of being treated as a second-class citizen. Tired, that is, of being treated like a 1930s black American. She passed for white and begged her mother to understand. Imitation of Life, based on Fannie Hurst's best-selling novel, traces the lives of two widows, one white and the employer, the other black and the servant. Each woman has one daughter. The white woman, Beatrice Pullman, played by Claudette Colbert, hires the black woman, Delilah, played by Louise Beavers, as a live-in cook and housekeeper. It is the depression, and the two women and their daughters live in poverty. Even a financially struggling white woman can afford a mammy. Their economic salvation comes when Delilah shares a secret pancake recipe with her boss. Beatrice opens a restaurant, markets the recipe, and soon becomes wealthy. She offers Delilah, the restaurant's cook, a 20% share of the profits. Regarding the recipe, Delilah, a true cinematic mammy, delivers two of the most pathetic lines ever from a black character. "I gives it to you, honey. I makes you a present of it." While Delilah is keeping her mistress's family intact, her relationship with Piola, her daughter, disintegrates. Piola is the antithesis of the mammy caricature. Delilah knows her place in the Jim Crow hierarchy, the bottom rung. Hers is an accommodating resignation, bordering on contentment. Piola hates her life, wants more, and wants to live as a white person, to have the opportunities that white people enjoy. Delilah hopes that her daughter will accept her racial heritage. He, God, made you black, honey. Don't be telling him his business. Accept it. Piola wants to be loved by a white man, to marry a white man. She's beautiful, sensual, and a potential wife to any white man who does not know her secret. Piola wants to live without the stigma of being black, and in the 1930s that stigma was real and miserable. Ultimately and inevitably, Piola rejects her mother, runs away, and passes for white. Delilah dies of a broken heart. A repentant and tearful Piola returns to her mother's funeral. And it goes on eventually to talk about one of the books that I read and all this sort of thing. I found it was very interesting, mostly because I wasn't aware of the literary and cinematic quality. But I mean, I was sort of aware of it, but I had never really read in depth about it or seen some of these posters or things like this. Obviously, I knew about the one drop roll, but it was kind of a fascinating thing into this sort of, biracial tragedy, and I was not aware that there was this sort of tragic mulatto myth sort of thing. And so I thought if I was learning about it, and I'm literally biracial, y'all might benefit from it as well. And so I thought we'd just kind of explore. We ran out of time last week, but it's been a little bit of a slow news week, so we have some time to dig into some other interesting stories. The end of the article is quite interesting, because it says here that the tragic mulatto stereotype claims that mulattoes can occupy the margins of two worlds, fitting into neither, accepted by neither. This is not true of real-life mulattoes. Historically, mulattoes were not only accepted into the black community, but were often its leaders and spokespersons, both nationally and at neighborhood levels. Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Elizabeth Ross Hayes, Mary Church Terrell, Thurgood Marshall, Malcolm X, and Louis Farrakhan were all mulattoes. Walter White, the former head of the NAACP, and Adam Clayton Powell, an outspoken congressman, were both light enough to pass for white. Other notable mulattoes include Langston Hughes, Billie Holiday, Gene Toomer, author of Cain, and the grandson of mulatto Reconstruction politician P.B.S. Pinchback. There was a tragedy in the lives of light-skinned black women, but there was also tragedy in the lives of most dark-skinned black women, them and men and children. The tragedy was not that they were black or had a drop of Negro blood, although white people saw that as a tragedy. Rather, the real tragedy was the way race was used to limit the chances of people of color. The 21st century finds America increasingly more tolerant of interracial unions and the resulting offspring. And that's, you know what, that's really true. And I was just having this conversation with a friend the other day, and I said, you know, it's a much different now than it was when I was a kid. When I was a kid, being biracial was rare, especially I grew up in a very white place in Colorado, so it was very rare. You stood out. People kind of wondered, like, what was wrong with you, or people kind of forget your own race, especially as I never pretended to be white, never have said I'm white, have always said I'm black, sort of thing. And I remember I was talking with one friend, just kind of like, oh yeah, we kind of forget that you're black, sort of thing. And it's also been troublesome in dating, and I ran into some racism there, especially from families and different things like that. And so, but it is very different now because it's become so much more common. A lot of people, especially my generation, but also younger, come from a more of a mixed racial background, whether that be immigrant, of a different country, or also black and white together. And so that's, it is a very different than it is now. But the world was not always kind. And so it's just important to remember our history and remember how far we've come. And every time I talk about race, I always tell people, as much as I may complain about it, and as much as other people complain about it, we always have to look back and be like, how far we've come. How far we have come. So, this is a good story. All right, so this was very interesting, and I was kind of taken aback when I saw this, but I love Ella McLeod and I love Mint Press News. It says here, rotten apple, dozens of former Israeli spies hired by Silicon Valley giant. It says here, Apple has made headlines in recent weeks for touting its commitment to privacy and human rights, rolling out tools to limit surveillance and spyware, but behind the corporate messaging lies a much darker reality. The company has quietly brought in dozens of veterans from Unit 8200, Israel's shadowy military intelligence unit known for blackmail, mass surveillance, and targeted killings. Many of these hires took place as Israel escalated its war in Gaza, and as CEO Tim Cook publicly expressed support for Israel while disciplining employees for pro-Palestinian expressions. Apple's deepening ties to Israel's most controversial intelligence raise uncomfortable questions, not only about the company's political loyalties, but also about how it handles vast troves of personal user data. A Mint Press News investigation has identified dozens of Unit 8200 operatives now working at Apple. The company's hiring spree coincides with growing scrutiny of its ties to the Israeli government, including its policy of matching employee donations to groups such as Friends of the IDF and the Jewish National Fund, both of which play a role in the displacement of the Palestinian people. The intense pro-Israel bias at the corporation has led many former and current employees to speak out. This investigation is part of a series examining the close collaboration between Unit 8200 and Western tech and media companies. Previous investigations examined the links between Unit 8200 and social media giants like TikTok, Facebook, and Google, and how former 8200 spies are now responsible for writing much of America's news about Israel and Palestine, holding top jobs at outlets like CNN and Axios. You want to talk about something that is very difficult and hard to talk and write about? This is it right here. I don't want to dig in to the whole thing, but it goes through some of the people and their LinkedIn profiles that are now working at Apple and have a history at Israeli military intelligence. And they're out there about it, sort of thing, and it gets into a lot of the people. And it says here, the growing number of former Israeli intelligence operatives working at Apple does not seem to concern the company's senior management. CEO Tim Cook is known to hold strongly pro-Israel views and has spearheaded the Silicon Valley giant's collaboration with the Israeli state. Apple has acquired several Israeli tech firms and now operates 3 centers in the country, employing around 2,000 people. In 2014, Cook invited Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the company headquarters in Cupertino, where in front of the cameras the two openly embraced. The following year, Cook accepted an invitation from President Reuven Rivlin to visit Israel. "It is a great privilege to host you and your team here," Rivlin said. "Even for me, as one who prefers to write with a pen and paper, it is clear what a great miracle you created when I look at my staff and my grandchildren." That's Tim Cook and Benjamin Netanyahu together. It says, to be fair, Apple is far from the only tech or media company to hire large numbers of former Unit 8200 operatives. A 2022 Mint Press expose revealed hundreds of Israeli intelligence veterans working at Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Amazon. Perhaps the most notable of these is Emmy Palmore, a former Israeli Justice Ministry official who sits at Facebook's 21-person oversight board. Described by Mark Zuckerberg as his platform's Supreme Court, the board ultimately decides what content is allowed or removed from the world's largest social network. Facebook has worked closely with the Israeli government to censor or deplatform Palestinian content and accounts. Even TikTok, often seen as a more open platform, because it's owned by the Chinese, has been hiring former Israeli spies to help manage its operations, according to a November investigation by Mint Press. Root Medalon, for example, served as a Unit 8200 intelligence commander and led its cybersecurity operations team. So, what does this all mean for us? It means that when you have these sorts of people in place, in tech, in media, it makes it very easy to manage the narrative. It makes it very easy to make sure the narrative goes your direction. And people that might speak out against your narrative, whether it be true or not, but are speaking out against your narrative, it makes it very easy to silence their voices. And I'll leave you with this one question. Then we gotta go. It's almost the top of the hour. We're gonna quickly go through the boy crisis. But I'll leave you with this one question on this one. Is that the type of society we want to live in? Regardless of how you feel about Israel and Palestine. Put that to one side. Do you want to live in a society where a foreign country installs people into major industrial players to manage the narrative of how they're spoken about? When China does this, there's outrage. When India does this, and they have done it, there's outrage. But when Israel does it, not a word. Well, except for me and Mint Press News. All of a sudden it's okay. And my only question is that a society you want to live in? And I'll tell you right now, for me, no. For a lot of them, Israel, China, India, the lot of them, I don't want to live in a society where foreign nations are influencing major companies and media. Not interested. But a lot of people will look at this and say, oh, well, that is kind of awful. Why do we care? Because this affects the narrative of what you think about this stuff. As Netanyahu once quipped, the most dangerous thing to Israel's national security is American public opinion. Because they know which side their bread is buttered on. And this is how they make sure that they protect themselves. And so when people on Twitter make various and sundry caustic conspiracy theories about Jewish people and Israel and all this type of thing, this stuff definitely doesn't help decrease those rumors and conspiracy theories at all. It reinforces them. And I'm not saying that Jewish people are out to get us, far from it, or that Israel's out to get us. I think far from it. But I think they understand that in order for the money spigots and the weapon spigots to stay open from the United States, they have to make sure American public opinion stays firmly on their side. And I think part of the reason why there's been so much outrage and financial punishment in the case of Colombia and their $200 million settlement they've come to with the Trump administration is that Israel does not want any sort of pro-Palestinian, anti-genocide movement to get legs in this country, because if it does, and it gets serious, they're in deep trouble. In terms of the continued existence of their country, will be in deep trouble. And that's why they do this. We can talk about whether it's right or wrong. We can talk about whether it's a good idea. We can talk about how pernicious it is. That's a whole other conversation. But that's what this all means. And in my mind, we should all be quite concerned about that. In our last story, I want to dash through this a little bit quickly because we've talked about it a great deal. But over the last several years, there's been a lot of talk about why men are falling behind in education and why, men just in general are falling behind. Men are no longer holding the most college degrees. Men are not necessarily, men's high school graduation rates are lower. Right now we have a terrible employment crisis with young men, even among college degrees. It's very tough to be a young man in today's society, and the story usually starts several years before in the K through 12 system. And we've had this talk for a long time, and then here comes Jessica Gross with the boy crisis is overblown. And she says, for the past few years, I've heard endlessly about the education crisis for boys. In short, compared to girls, boys around the world are underperforming academically, and this is described as a distinctly modern problem. At this point, it is assumed that young boys and men are at a disadvantage in schools and need help that girls and young women do not. Reactionary conservative commentators, including Jordan Peterson, say boys are underperforming in school because the vast majority of teachers are not only female, but infantilizing female and radically left. Boys are made to sit for hours at a time, which is against their nature, and they are told that their ambition is pathological. Peterson said in a conversation with my Times reporter colleague David French. More liberal or centrist pundits such as Richard Reeves, the author of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters and What to Do About It, agree that part of the problem is a lack of male teachers, and track the problem back to 1972 when Title IX was passed. Within a decade, women had caught up and then just blew right past the men in terms of college graduation rates, Reeves said. I had long accepted that the basic premise that a lack of male teachers drove the crisis among learning young boys, and that these problems are fairly recent, but sometime this spring I started thinking about the stories I'd heard from older friends and relatives, men and women, about their own school experiences. Boys and girls were made to sit for long periods of time in the 1950s, and their punishment for disobeying was likely harsher than is in many schools today. I've heard so many stories, tales of nuns hitting kids with rulers. I don't think there was a widespread embrace of boys acting out in the classroom in previous generations, and yet no one is arguing that American education of the Eisenhower era made boys less ambitious. This revelation made me want to see if there was an actual empirical support for the boy crisis argument. What I found shocked me. There's not much solid evidence that boys do better with male teachers, and girls have been getting better grades than boys since before women had the right to vote. Let's start with what Peterson says about the radically left political leanings of female teachers. In 2021, the Heritage Foundation, hardly a liberal bastion, found that, quote, a nationally representative survey of K-12 teachers does not support the idea that America's public school teachers are radical activists. And further, quote, teachers may very well be allies, not opponents, in the pushback against the application of critical race theory and other divisive ideologies in the classroom, unquote. But what about the fact that the majority of American teachers are now women? The teaching force in the United States has been majority female for over 100 years. Reeves notes that the current teaching force is 23% male, which is roughly what it was between 1920 and 1940. The number of male teachers ticked up a bit after World War II, but peaked at 30%. It's not like public schools are bereft of male leadership either. While women make up the majority of elementary school principals, men dominate middle and high school administrations. Only a quarter of superintendents who are in charge of multiple public schools or districts are women. What's more, the evidence that students do better with same-gender teachers is mixed at best. For example, a 2021 study using 7 years of data looked at the students in Indiana from grades 3 through 8 and found that female teachers are better at increasing both male and female students' achievement than their male counterparts in elementary and middle schools. And, quote, contrary to popular speculation, boys don't exhibit higher academic achievement when they're assigned male teachers, unquote. The biggest positive effect was for girls when they had female math teachers. All that said, research that really surprised me was a meta-analysis of 2014 by Daniel and Susan Voyer that showed that girls have been outperforming boys in school since 1914. She also mentions a 2006 Newsweek article suggesting boys across the United States are falling behind girls in terms of school achievement, whereas 30 years ago it was presumably females who were lagging. Unfortunately, no specific references were provided to support these statements. However, this did not prevent more reporting of the so-called boy crisis in various newspapers, magazines, and other media. And so she basically sums it up. She said, to sum it up, it's been seen by some as unmanly to study, and there's less of a social cost to girls to be nerdy and to be seen trying to do well. Based on Voyer's analysis, the gender performance gaps were smallest in regions like Scandinavia because they're very strong on gender equity, he said. I also wondered if boys are being socialized at home to know that they don't have to put as much effort as their mothers and sisters, which might have a knock-on effect. So much of doing well in school in the modern workforce is executive function and organization. If every domestic task or household plan is carried out by a woman, boys may not learn that they need to try. As one high schooler interviewed about why boys take on fewer leadership roles in school told Education Week's Elizabeth Huback earlier this year, quote, guys know that if they sit back and relax, something will get done by somebody else, unquote. And I thought that was an interesting sort of, excuse for what is going on. The opinion piece focuses on male teachers and education. I think it's kind of everything taken together. Men are less academically inclined than women, and that's not any great secret. I think a lot of male teachers are not attracted to the profession because the pay is so low. I think if teachers were paid better, that'd be good for teachers, but it would also be good for attracting men to the profession. I think especially post No Child Left Behind and post Race to the Top, the obsession with standardized testing is not helpful, and I talk about this in my essay, Teachers and Chalkboards, in the What the Hell is Going On collection. I think there's, that factor as well. But I think there's also, men need to have something to work for. They need to have a goal in mind. There needs to be a payoff. Education, the payoff is long. It takes patience. It takes time. It's not necessarily a one-to-one sort of thing. You see the tech bros be like, why do I have to take general, ed class? I just want to do my computer science stuff and go on with my life. This is the modern education, and that's even in higher ed, which is designed very much by men. I think the payoff for young men just isn't really there. And unfortunately, we're moving into an economy where, she's right, organization, executive function is very much an important thing, and those are things women excel at. Women are very good at getting things done, being organized about it. Men tend to be less so. And the economy is not necessarily allowing for that as much as it used to be. And I think that is also part of the crisis. But I think with boys having, allowing them to excel in the things that they're good at, allowing them to, that sort of physicality, the ability to kind of run off that energy, all that sort of thing is incredibly helpful. It was interesting that data tends not to support the running theory that school has been too feminized and men aren't necessarily invested, in it sort of thing. That was kind of the interesting part, so I read the most of it. But I think there's still a story there. For me, the problem is we don't focus on it. No one's caring about the fact that men are falling behind. And history shows that tends to bite us in the ass. Put it simply. When you have too many unemployed young men running around, it's not a good thing. Doesn't end well. Ever, really. I think it needs to be more of a focus. As far as that goes. We'll keep talking about men's issues, as I always do. I've written about it extensively, so we'll keep talking about it. I'm hot and a little bit tired because it was a very sleepy day, so I'm going to get off this stream. Thank you all so much for watching. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal News Hour. You can find me online at Cameron Journal on TikTok, at Cameron Cowan on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Do sign up for the newsletter, CameronJoel.com/newsletter, and you'll get the new newsletter straight to your inbox. I am running a current series right now in support of my book, America's Lost Generation, called Under the Millennials Collection. It's right on the front page of CameronJoel.com, so head over and check that out. It's the best of the book delivered to you. So that's something we'll keep talking about more, and there'll be some new exclusive videos coming out for that very, very soon. So thank you all so much for watching. I appreciate it. Have a wonderful night. Good night.